Hi, and welcome to another episode. Always a delight to have you join us on the show where we share inspiration, motivation, ideas, and tips from leaders all around the world who are doing very cool things in their careers and their lives, in the hope that you gain some inspiration and motivation, but also some practical things that you might be able to apply in your own leadership journey. And as you know, I'm a big fan of doing less but achieving more, of thinking about how do we hone in on making sure we spend our time on our major things and not majoring in our minor things, and that we look at how can we be more productive but without burning out, without getting to those points of adrenal fatigue, which I know I've talked about in other episodes I've experienced myself. And it's why I bang on about wanting leaders to learn, how do we get that kind of balance? How do we become all the good things that we want to be and serve and do all the great things, but not actually fry ourselves in the process? And I recently heard our beautiful guest today, Alex, and I heard him on another podcast and I was like, oh, he's got all the goods. We need to get him on here to share some of his wisdom with you. So my guest today is Alex Soojung-Kim, and it's Pang, but maybe if you're Googling it, Pang sometimes finds or Pong finds the answer. So welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for tuning in today from across the ocean in the US.
Well, thanks very much for having me, AJ.
It's always great to meet other people in their sweet spot and doing what they're meant to do in the world. And I can tell that you're a man who has found that sweet spot and has found a place where you love what you're doing. But I'm really curious about, where did your career start? And maybe you didn't begin in that spot. You know, how did you get to be where you are today?
Well, none of us have the lives that we plan for or expect that we're going to have. So it's but my origin story was I studied history of science in college and graduate school with the intention of being an academic, and had a couple postdocs, wrote my first book, which was an academic monograph, and then however, um, did not get an academic job, the market in the United States being terrible, and so moved to publishing and eventually became, and after doing that for a few years, moved back to Silicon Valley and became a technology forecaster and futurist. And this turned out to be really interesting work for me because it was, in a sense, a field in which you asked a lot of the same kinds of questions that you do as a historian of science or technology. You're just kind of turning the instrument around and pointing it at the future rather than the past. History of technology is all about understanding how technologies are shaped by economic and social and legal, et cetera, forces, and the ways in which they then in turn help kind of co-create the world in which they are deployed. And as a futurist, you're really asking very much the same kinds of questions about how technology and people can create the world of the future. And this is really interesting work, but I, after a few years, found myself constantly sort of half a project behind. Being a consultant is the sort of work where it's very difficult to ever say no to anything because, it's very cyclical, feast or famine. And so when times are good, you really want to kind of stack up as many projects as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found at a certain point, had kind of burned out on the work, but fortunately had an opportunity to take a step back to go to Microsoft research
Mm-hmm.
in Cambridge in the UK. And it was there that I discovered, had of the work that eventually became my book Rest, where I was doing really interesting stuff, reading a lot, talking to cool people, but found I didn't feel the sort of time pressure that, and kind of sense perpetually of being behind the eight ball that is just kind of part of everyday life here in Silicon Valley. And it made me think that maybe our assumptions that of success has to be kind of an arms race with burnout, right? That doing good work requires a level of sort of self-sacrifice or sort of putting your own sort of health and relationships at risk in the service of some great
Mm.
deed. Maybe that stuff actually, maybe that assumption is actually completely backwards. That in fact, in order to do the kind of work that we all strive to do, work that is compelling to us, that's meaningful, and that makes a mark in the world, it's actually necessary to sort of ease off some and sort of to bring more of rest, to work differently in a way that brings more rest into sort of your daily life. And that would be a wellspring for new ideas, for higher levels of creativity, ultimately higher levels of productivity,
Mm.
and would allow you to have a longer and more successful, sustainable sort of working life. And it turned out there was a sort of whole literature in neuroscience and the psychology of creativity that helped explain why this could be the case, as well as a lot of examples from the lives of people like Nobel Prize winners and famous authors, composers, etc.,
Mm.
that showed at a very granular kind of level that even people who were obsessed with their work, who made all sorts of life choices about their work, didn't actually spend their entire days working, right?
Yeah.
You might make a choice about who you married, where you lived, sort of based upon a desire to do sort of a certain kind of work, but that didn't mean that you spent 18 hours a day doing it. And again, and
Mm.
instead you would work in bursts of a few hours. And generally maybe, you know, doing this for 4 or 5 days very steadily, very regularly
Mm.
turned out to be a way of working that allowed you to produce things like the Fifth Symphony or The Origin of Species. And there was work of by psychologists and sociologists and folks who helped explain why it is that this might be the case.
Mm.
And so that was, and so in a way, it was a project that was both an effort to explain my own, you know, to chart a course out of a way of working that I had bought into, but really didn't work for me,
Mm.
in a way that also drew upon both sort of drew upon my previous training as an as an historian. So that's how it is that I got interested in this question of the relationship of the place of rest in in busy lives and how we can how and why we should make space for it. And then you know to close off the story, my work these days on sort of companies that are moving to 4-day work weeks is really a build on that, in the sense that the 4-day week brings the principles of rest into people's lives at scale. So it's not just you having to figure this stuff out for yourself, sometimes in opposition to or with resistance, fighting resistance from your boss or your peers, but rather all of you doing it together in
Right.
ways that allow you not just to do it yourself, but also to support each other, which
Mm.
proves to be a much more sort of manageable and sustainable way of changing how you work. So, um, long answer to a simple question.
But there's so much in that that we can unpack, and I think there is the basis of our chat today. I love that you kind of talk about being a reverse historian. Kind of, I'd never thought or heard of a futurist being called that way, but it's so
Mhm.
true. And it's interesting. I think, we have before Christ, after Christ, before the iPhone, after the iPhone, before COVID, after COVID. Like, to me, there's kind of been these really big times in mankind's history, and how we've worked and lived. And
Mm-hmm.
certainly COVID has brought around opportunity for people to live and work, particularly office workers, in a different way, and to consider how that is. And I know for myself, my own journey, I experienced corporate burnout, where it was exactly what you were saying. I'd bought into a way of working and understood it to be the length of time I was sitting at my desk each day, that was the measure of my worth in lots of ways. And I remember when I first stepped into a director role, a senior role, being told by other executives that were already in the C-suite that, are you married? Be prepared for that to end, and be prepared, for the physical impact that this is going to have. And I was like, are you kidding? No, I'm not going to buy into that. But 7 years on in senior exec roles, I very much saw the physical impact and the strain on relationships and friendships and all of those sorts of things that I just couldn't maintain because of the length of time I was working. And so I too have kind of discovered a different way and realized that's not my best modus operandi. And these days I do batch my work. So I do about 2 hours at a time. Then I live on land. So I go out and I plow a field, or I plant a tree, or I do something, go for a bushwalk. Then I come back and I might do another couple of hours, and then I'll go outside again and, spend time in nature. And what I find is I'm far more productive now and far more satisfied and healthy and feel younger than I did when I was in corporate. So I really think you're onto something here. I'm curious about how people can have these conversations with their peers and their boss and their colleagues if this is not the way of their workplace, because many of the leaders and managers that I work with are looking to shift. And I have a whole program called the 10-degree shift, which is about how can we make tiny incremental changes to start moving towards what we want. But for a lot of them, they go, but this is the culture here. So how do you advise or share what you've learned through all your research with people who are going, yeah, but the trend in my industry or my business is not that?
Right. Two things first. I mean, culture follows practice, right? There is often, in my experience, you know, culture can often feel like an obstacle to big change because it's kind of amorphous. It's something that is kind of out there that we all partake in, but none of us are really responsible for. And therefore, changing it feels like both a prerequisite for changing other things, and it's also something that's impossible for anybody to consciously change. However, my experience working with, by now, hundreds of organizations that have moved to 4-day work weeks, in other words, reducing their working hours without cutting salaries or cutting expectations around project deadlines, level of service to clients, etc., is that you change very tangible things like meeting length and of workflows and the rules around when you can, or around the design of the workday, and culture shifts as a consequence of that. So the first thing I would say is that don't be constrained by culture, because it's, it will move with you.
Yeah.
On a more practical basis, the more practical answer to the question is that, number one, in virtually every industry, there are now companies that have, or nonprofits or government agencies that have successfully made a transition to 4-day work weeks. On the government side, it is everyone from the public sectors in the United Arab Emirates and Iceland, two places that could not be more different,
Yeah.
in terms of the way in which their states are designed, and the role that the civil service plays in everyday life, to very mission-driven nonprofits like Greenpeace or Amnesty International, to companies ranging from small advertising agencies to tech companies with a couple thousand people. And so, number one, there probably are examples of companies like yours that already are doing it. Second, there's a whole body of sort of research that explains, number one, what the magnitude of benefit that comes to employees as well as managers and executives and everybody when you move to a shorter work week.
Mm.
You know, one of the important things about the movement is that the 4-day week is something that everyone in a company does together, from the CEO down to the newest hire. And that turns it from being a kind you know, sort of zero-sum game in which, you know, which we often encounter when, as individuals, we might try to go to a flexible schedule or a 4-day week, to being a win-win, right? Something that we all create together. And indeed, it turns out that executives, you know, face higher levels of burnout, substance abuse, depression, etc., than rank and file workers, and therefore they need this more than anybody. And indeed, the numbers are even higher for founders and CEOs. But you know, so there's a whole bunch of research that explains why this is good, why it leads to better outcomes for organizations. And then there's also, I think, some craft around taking, you know, taking those examples of predecessor companies of the research and explaining, all right, how can we get started here? And the um, the comparison I make is, you know, these movies, like One Last Job movies, where it's like, you know, or of the ex-con who's going straight has to steal 50 cars in the next 24 hours, or, you know, or the mafia is going to kill their brother or something like this, right?
The
Okay,
typical ransomy kind of
right,
thing. Yeah.
right. Or, you know, the retired spy making a new life, or has to go back into the field because an arch nemesis who they thought was dead is now back and is sort of doing terrible things.
Yeah,
Okay,
one last job.
right. All of those movies, in addition to there being one last job, also have a couple other things, share a couple of things. One is it's never just the person doing the one last job. One of the first things you do is you get the old team back together. You know, another thing is you make a plan, and then only after you've convinced, you know, sort of coaxed other people out of retirement, recruited the new kid, made peace with the old adversary who also hates this sort of hates this enemy, only then are you able actually to kind of step out and make it happen. Moving to a 4-day week is somewhat like that, in the sense that every organization that does it has to have sort of permission from the top
Right.
to sort of in order to do it. And no CEO, when they tell the story of how they've done this, has done it alone. There's always a small team of people who help them, you know, who help figure out the details around of the logistics and the implementation and the payroll side and the HR issues, etc. They all work together, they make a plan, and then finally you take it out into the field, and inevitably things don't go the way that you expect, but you have enough skill assembled together and enough enthusiasm behind it so that even when sort of your plan starts to sort of maybe go a little wrong, or at least come up against the hard edges of reality, you're able to adapt and make it work anyway. And so, you know, I think that you know, if you are, let's say, a head of people and culture, or you know, someone who's in meetings of that sort, that the thing to do is think in terms of being one of those supporting characters, right? Being one of those members of the team, and inviting the top leadership to step into that role of sort of leading this initiative. And that if you're able to do that, right, you can, you know, or if you show that you've got this team of people who want to do this, that it's feasible, even if it seems kind of crazy, that you have a plan for doing it. You maybe have an escape hatch if things really start to go wrong,
Mhm.
and you've got a way of making of sort of monitoring that so that you can make course corrections, and then invite the person at the top to step into that leadership role and and to sign on. That I think can go a long way to making it possible, to making it, yeah, or to making it possible for them to envision how
Mm.
this could work for the entire organization, and how to envision themselves taking on a leadership role in it. So yeah, think in terms of one last job, plenty of data behind you, but ultimately it's really a story about how all of you can work together in order to make this happen.
I love that. And I think in anything, in any change in history, isn't it the story that goes with it that's so important? And if the leadership team are not bought in or telling that story, you can see why things would fall over. But with them on board leading that, and the team, like you're saying, getting the A team back together or whatever, you can see how organizations could even tiptoe in and, like you're saying, have almost a safety net that if this isn't working or we're not getting these results, we have an opportunity to stop, hold back, review, go
Sure.
again.
Right.
But I can remember even a decade ago working with someone who was returning from maternity leave, and she asked to work compressed hours. So she asked to work her 5-day week, but in 4 days. So she would work longer days. And everyone was like, oh, you can't do that. And she was like, why not? Like, you're still going to get the same out of me, whether I'm sitting here on Monday or Friday or whatever it might be. And for a while, she did it, but there was a whole heap of resentment from other people. Yeah, but I think the world is completely different now, and there are lots of different ways we can find the way that we work. And I think you're right, painting that picture, because people can't create what they can't see. And that's
Mhm.
part of the challenge, isn't it, in the futurist kind of realm, is that we don't embrace stuff if we can't see how would I use that? How's that going to work for me? So that painting the picture and finding examples is really important. And gone are the days where it was only, oh, that's what they, do maybe in Denmark. It used to be kind of always the Danes or someone that were painted, but now it's everywhere. It's all around the world.
Yeah. When I first started researching this back in 2017 or so, one of the things that really impressed me and that made me realize there was a book to be written about this was that I was finding companies all over the world in a variety of industries who were discovering 4-day work weeks and putting them into practice, who didn't actually know each other or talk to each other. And that two of the places that had the largest concentrations of companies doing this were Japan and Korea, right? Two places whose languages have their own words for working yourself to death, right? It's a common enough problem that you've got one word for it.
Exactly.
And so, and at this point it is absolutely, not the case that it's just like, lifestyle friendly companies where, it's like, people selling, surf wax out of their vans, like down by the beach, right?
Yeah.
It is software startups and fintech companies and Michelin starred restaurants and places that want to do absolutely world-class work, led by people who are alpha types who like to build beautiful things. And if and for them, the 4-day week is a way of attracting similar people who are
Mm-hmm.
smart enough about work and their careers to recognize that this offers a unique opportunity to sort of figure out how to work in ways that are more intelligent and thoughtful and sustainable in order to create more sustainable organizations and to make it possible to do work of a high quality for decades to come rather than just for the next few years. And I think also, to build on your that maternity example, that this is, I think the pandemic has changed how we all work faster and more profoundly than we ever thought possible. I had one CEO who said in 2019, work from home was the hill I would die on. I absolutely knew there was no way we ever could do it. And in 2020, my people proved me wrong in about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And, you know, and so I can no longer look at any initiative and say, no, that won't work here,
Mm.
because the thing that I knew absolutely wouldn't work did. And so I think that we are now at a point where there is this space for rethinking work and for making it something that is sort of that works better, that is more meaningful and works for sort of more of us, not just like 20, 22 to 28-year-old single guys without houseplants who can sleep under their desks. And indeed, in 4-day week companies, one of the groups that has been sort of not just the most enthusiastic about adopting this, but also the people who have developed the practices that make it possible are working moms.
Mm.
That there's, for example, Pursuit Marketing, which is a B2B call center in Glasgow. And,
Mm.
you know, um, B2B sales, you're on the phone all the time. Absolutely everything is measured. You've got daily targets and quotas and bonuses, etc. And so it's not a very touchy-feely business. But Pursuit Marketing realized at a certain point that they could move to a 4-day week because they had a growing number of working moms who were doing like 4 days, sometimes even 3, who were hitting their targets just as effectively as the men in the office 5 days were.
Right.
And these previously had been a group who were looked at as, well, is she really serious about her career because she's only in the office 3 days a week? And all of a sudden, when the company decided to move to a 4-day week, they became the people who knew all this stuff about how to do the job that everyone else wanted to learn. And
Yeah.
so they went from being these kind of marginal characters in the organization to being much more central. And so I think that one of the unexpected things that the 4-day week does is turn a group who have an awful lot of skill, who often are somewhat underappreciated within their organizations, and whose desire to find a better way to work for them and their families has been treated as a sign of unseriousness.
Mm.
Finally get sort of the respect that they deserve and be seen rightly as people who are figuring out a way of working that can work at scale for all of us.
Yeah, amazing. And it's so true, isn't it? Because there's that research that shows as humans, we fill the space we give ourselves. So if you give
Mhm.
yourself an hour to do a task, you'll take the hour. If you give yourself 15 minutes, you'll knock out something in 15 minutes because that's all you've got.
Right.
And so you're right. A lot of women probably led the way in that whole learning to work part-time and to cram and be efficient and probably waste a bit less at the water cooler and double handling things and those sorts of things because they've got to be efficient. And
Mhm.
I know recently I've been working with a state-based government agency here, and they actually have in one of their very senior executive roles 2 women sharing the role. So they're actually doing it. One does 2.5 days and the other one does 3 days a week. So they have some lap over kind of and handover. And they do incredibly well because they communicate really well with each other. They make sure they deal with stuff on the day. They don't necessarily go, I'll flick that and leave it to the other person.
Mhm.
So, and they're really clear with their staff and their direct reports about how do you work with us, and how to make that work for others as well, where they're like, should I keep going to you because I spoke to the other one yesterday? So
Mhm.
they've been doing it really successfully for about a year. So, things like that are really shifting. Um,
Look,
hmm,
AJ, what you've just described, clear handoffs, lots of communication, sort of effective divisions of labor. These are all things that over and over again we see 4-day week companies having to learn, and many hiring partners or people and culture heads discovering that there's actually a group of highly skilled people who already have had to develop those particular skills, as
Mm.
well as just at a personal level, a degree of sort of time management ability, a certain ruthlessness over attention, combined with a degree of empathy and a respect for other people's time. And that is the working mothers who are already on their on their staffs. That it's a common that they turn out to possess a combination of both sort of hard technical or professional skills, as well as sort of time management and a sort of set of cultural attributes that turn out to be absolutely essential for making 4-day weeks work. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I know these two leaders, when I spoke to them, they said that they learned pretty quick they had to be ruthless, like you're saying. So in the beginning, they said, oh, sometimes there'd be a big thing, a big event or something that was important on one of their days off. And in the beginning, they'd go, I better come in for that. And eventually they went, no, because my colleague who's there representing the role will be there.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said they actually had to get quite ruthless about going, no, I don't come in on my day off. And what they've found is that people respect that even more. Whereas when they worked full time, they said their time was very messy and bled into after hours and all those sorts of things. So they're experiencing a lot more freedom in saying no to stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of come full circle and start to wrap us up, I love that you said that 4-day working week organizations are attracting similar people and that it's an intelligent way to do high quality work. I think if anything, when you're talking to an A-type personality or someone who's a leader that's like, oh, I'm not sure about this, if they heard that this is the more superior, intelligent way to work and you're going to get better, higher quality of work, I would say some of them are going to start rethinking, and going, oh, maybe I better get on board, even if it's just because that sounds more appealing. So to
Mm-hmm.
kind of wrap out, I'd love to know, what have you seen through your research and the people you've worked with, the benefits to an organization and the individuals?
Sure. So, I think that, first off, you're quite right that there's a category of professional for whom, or if there's a light bulb that turns on when they realize, actually, is it more professional to be able to do this work in 4 days, or, require 5 days plus a few, nights bringing homework?
Mm-hmm.
Who is it who actually is better at their jobs? Let's think about that. But in terms of, if you can sort of do this, the benefits, there are benefits both for people and their families, as well as for the organization.
Mm.
Now, not surprisingly, at the individual level, you see improvements in self-reported scores of work-life balance, lower work-family interference, lower levels of stress. People talk less about burning out or being in danger of burning out. They also report sleeping about half an hour more per night, which doesn't necessarily sound like an awful lot, but over the course of a year or two, it's actually something that has measurable impacts on health and well-being. They also are better. They also report being happier at their jobs and being more productive, partly because there's a whole bunch of stuff you got to figure out in order to make a 4-day week work, in terms of making meetings shorter, redesigning the workday to give everybody time for deep focused work, for collaboration, and time for social time, which actually improves the quality of each of those times. And but also by so you have a level of kind of social coordination that makes people feel like they're more part of a team. And at the same time, there's a lot of stuff you got to figure out about how to do your own job better that requires kind of taking ownership of your work in a way that often you're not necessarily able to in a 5-day week,
Mhm.
to having the autonomy to do some redesign, some experimentation, and thereby sort of making the work itself feel sort of more meaningful. For organizations, what this means is that not only do you have a better rested, more motivated, more
Mhm.
autonomous workforce, you also have a workforce that is less, or that has more time for professional development type things, and is also less likely to quit. And in fields where you have high levels of turnover, where either losing someone is very expensive or hiring someone and training them
So,
is, is expensive, that can really add up. So, for example, in hospitals that have adopted this, or for nurses and nurse managers, it's turned out that, even when you do things like change shifts so that people are working 6-hour shifts rather than 8 hours, but
mhm.
still being paid for the equivalent of 40 hours work, the organizations that do this have to hire more people, but they save so much in improvements in turnover, in lower sick leave, and less spend on temp agency people who cost 5 times as much,
Mhm.
that these programs actually pay for themselves.
Yeah.
And so across all of these different levels, the personal, the team, or of the organization, across of across a range of benefits, we see that it's good financially, it's good for building organizational resilience. It's, clients turn out to sort of be somewhere between neutral and highly supportive.
Mm.
And it means that people are able to feel better about their work, to have more, to feel better after work,
Mm.
and to have, and to imagine themselves being able to do even highly stressful jobs for sort of long, sort of for more of their lives, and to get more out of it. So those are the benefits.
So many, so good. And it reminds me of my 10-degree shift program is based a lot largely on the blue zones around the world where people live to
Hmm.
be, centenarians, and they live happy and healthy. And for a lot of
Hmm.
them, they have experienced a bit more life work balance. They
Hmm.
exercise more, they eat well, but also they have hobbies and interests outside of their work. And I can see
Yes.
how having a 4-day week as well would allow people to pursue passions maybe outside of work, so they'd have energy for those sorts of things as well. There's just so much of a ripple effect. We weren't born to be machines,
No,
yeah.
no, and I think that, the hobbies thing is something that I also saw when I was writing Rest. That there are lots of, people who are like famous, famous scientists who also are very dedicated musicians or painters, or, sort of athletes, like serious
Mhm.
rock climbers. And it turns out that those hobbies are things that provide a kind of really valuable break from work that otherwise they would become kind of overly obsessed with. But it also, it's often the case that those hobbies provide some of the same kinds of psychological satisfactions as their work when it goes well, without the frustrations or the long time spans of sort of complicated experiments,
Mm.
or, and so helps remind them of what they love about work when it goes really well, and to
Yeah.
get some of that same kind of satisfaction in a very different kind of environment.
Yeah.
So I think that, we often think of, of hobbies as kind of dilettantish, or sort of not particularly important or worth the time of serious people. But that turns out to be absolutely wrong.
Yes.
That it is, it's very, that we can get satisfaction even from things that maybe objectively we're not terribly good at, but turn out to still sort of enrich our lives and enrich our work.
Yeah. And make us more interesting, happy, whole people ultimately. And I think years ago, I saw clues of the 4-day week in that it was more a 4.5-day week, but I worked in healthcare. And at the hospital, then a lot of the senior surgeons and doctors would take Wednesday afternoon off, and they all either went golfing or they went yachting, sailing. And so there was this thing where they networked. They all went and played golf or they went sailing together every Wednesday afternoon. And it was like the nurses used to complain that you can't find a doctor on a Wednesday afternoon. But a lot of them said it's where they had their best creative ideas. It's where they would negotiate new collaborations and all sorts of things whilst they were just in that free flow of something that was more enjoyable. So I think all of the research you've shared from your book Rest and also everything that you've been studying is definitely the way that humanity and our workplaces need to go. I think there's still some work to be done in areas like construction and things like that. I've been recently working with an airport that's being constructed, and a lot of blue collar workers there, and they're working 6-day weeks. So, and crazy long hours, which is why they start to see some safety incidents happening and all those sorts of things. So I do think the white collar office work might have embraced it, but there's still some work to get it into other areas and of our workplaces. But I love what you've shared. I know people are going to have lots of little takeaways as well as maybe some convincing to do and some selling it up the line. Alex, how can people find more, read more? Because you do have a number of books and resources and things. What's the best website or place for people to go and explore a bit more? Because no doubt you've got some of that research, compiled into those.
Sure. So my own consulting company is called Strategy and Rest, and it's strategy.rest, which Rest, fortunately, for me is a top level domain now. And that's got, if you want to learn more about my book, Rest, or Work Less, Do More, which is about the 4-day week or other things, links to those are there, as well as links to talks and podcasts, other lesser podcasts than yours, of course, and various other things. And then for the 4-day week, you can also check things out at 4-day week global, which is 4dayweek.com, and where I'm a sort of director of research and innovation. And so that has links to a number of our case studies, as well as the more technical reports looking at the numbers on personal benefit, organizational benefit, productivity improvements, etc.
Right.
So those are the places.
If you're trying to convince an executive or a board and they love their numbers, go and have a look at some of those case studies there that Alex has generously shared on 4dayweek.com. I'll be sure to put a link in all of the show notes. Lastly, any final things that you want to share that we didn't get a chance to for leaders or people listening?
I think that it's just important to take rest seriously. That we often assume that I'll sleep when I'm dead, and all too often that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you probably won't be able to do the things that you want to do on the way to that early grave. And so I think that take rest seriously is the first thing. The second is this all becomes a lot easier if you're able to do it with other people. That we all face these challenges with overwork and burnout and imbalances in our work and personal lives. And the fact that we all have these problems suggests that maybe we ought to try and solve them together. That in fact, collective action might turn out to be the most potent form of self-care, and that working together on these problems will yield more sustainable and enduring solutions than trying to just do them on our own. So
I love that. And been practicing that in my own household now. My partner's working 3 days a week and I work 4. And we use our Fridays as hobby day. And so we both pursue our own hobbies and passions on that day. And it really has shifted our own mental health and well-being, but also has deepened our relationship in many ways. Even though we go away and do our hobbies, we come back together. And so I can absolutely say it's totally changed the way I view work. and purpose and meaning in life. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing everything. It's been phenomenal. I can't wait to hear how it lands with other people tuning in.
Thank you, AJ. It's been a pleasure.
Have a great evening over there in California.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.